Okay, we just did it. We just bridged a vast chasm. The moment of time and space in which I sit here in my attic talking into this microphone, and the moment in which you just hit play and are listening have come together. It's a beautiful thing. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. Everyone else, thanks for coming back round. How are you feeling? How are you holding up? Just now, before I hit record, I was thinking to myself, what's going on with me right now? I was trying to feel into the moment, and a word popped into my mind. The word was flux. So I looked it up. And the word flux has two simultaneous meanings. The first is what I had in mind, like a state of flux, as in continuous change or fluctuations. But the word flux also means diarrhea, as in a steady, continuous flow of shit. See? Doesn't it work perfectly? Aren't both of those things at play right now? I have to find ways to make myself laugh about it, y'all, or I just feel too overwhelming and scary. I've been successfully following my own directives that I've been spouting off about here on the show, setting better boundaries, making sure I'm having time where I'm filling my head with the beauty and the awe and the majesty of nature and this life that I am experiencing. At the same time, I don't want to be uninformed about what's happening in our societies. I don't want to put my head in the sand. At the same time, I want to put my head in the sand because it's such an onslaught, it's such a bombardment. There just doesn't seem to be many voices out there that are speaking in a way that feels to me to be honest, frankly. I will say that as much as there are all of these things that seem to be happening in the external world that I just don't have any control over, that are having an impact on me and my family and our lives, there is something I do have say in, which is my internal landscape. And in that regard, I'm doing well. I'm feeling more clear than I have in a long time, I should say. And I hope that that might be true for you. I hope that you might have some tools that you're utilizing as well that could give you a sense of anchor or center. It just seems so important right now that we not just feel ourselves being thrown with the winds of talking points, and that we could feel a sense of ground underneath us that comes from within that can't be touched by all of that. Fortunately, my conversation today with Melissa McKay is very much about this. In fact, the next few weeks, y'all, we're going to get into it. We're going to get into some deep considerations of who we are and how to be in the world, and tools that we can utilize to help us meet these challenges. And I'm just super excited that I was able to connect with Melissa again. I met her many, many years ago. She was teaching meditation back then, and she's someone who has always presented meditation teachings in a way that felt to me to be honest and authentic and helpful. So this conversation really filled me up some. I was glad to have had it, and I'm very happy to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I do just want to say that if you've been enjoying the show and you want to get access to the full archives or you want to support it, you might consider becoming a podcast premium subscriber. If you want to connect with me in other ways besides just listening to the show, if you want to check out my weekly live classes or my on-demand video stuff, you can find everything I'm doing at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I'm actually going to just leave it there. We're keeping things a little bit concise because me and Melissa, we went on for a bit, and I don't want to hold you here much longer. I just want to get to it. So I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Melissa McKay. Hello?
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Melissa.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. Good. All things considered, I always like to throw that in there.
Right. You're in Philadelphia?
I am in Easton, Pennsylvania. It's about equidistant from Pennsylvania as it is to New York. I'm kind of like right in the middle between New York and Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Oh, okay. I know where that is then. Nice. You liking it there?
I am. I moved here in 2017 after I let go of my yoga center that I had for 10 years in Williamsburg.
Yep. So we left right around the same time then.
Oh, okay. I remember you went West Coast, right?
I did. Well, first on the tour with my son. And then.
Right. School of Rock. Isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. And I have to say, I have memories of, it's Phoenix, right? His name is Phoenix?
Yeah, Phoenix, yeah.
I remember him as a young boy and everyone being like, oh, that kid's he was already like playing guitar, if I remember.
Yeah, because his dad was a guitar player. So he just got a lot of exposure early on. And, most kids that are going to go and take an hour lesson, to whatever, you just don't get that kind of explode. They would just play. And he was interested in it. You throw a ball at him and he'd run away from it. But, anything, he was just interested. It just grabbed his attention. Interest is such an interesting thing, because if somebody's interested, then they give it all their attention. And
I know. I have friends in Finland, and like the way they run their educational system is sort of based on that principle more, that they sort of let the kids decide where their interests are and then learn there. Yeah. And they get much better educational outcomes than we do.
Yeah, they do. I would imagine you can't take away, and they tend to have some kind of interest, and some of them don't find so. I was actually worried for a period of time because I was like, school is not his thing, and athletics are not his thing or whatever. And then music just became his thing. And he was always getting in trouble in school and all of that. So his story was really funny. And how many times I went to a principal's office to talk about Phoenix at school. And then suddenly we got casted in this Broadway show. It was really hilarious. So he found his thing. We went to a couple Broadway shows, and every time I would watch him light up. And his dad took him to School of Rock, and he just proclaimed it to the universe, I'm going to be in that. And then they had an open call, and it was like, bam, bam, bam. And he got it.
Wow. Well, I have to say, there was a moment where you had some kind of gathering or party at what was both your yoga center and home in Greenpoint, if I remember.
Yep.
And my, at the time, girlfriend, now wife of almost 20 years, it's been that long since we've talked. She and I went to that party, and Phoenix was there with you. And I think that's a memory in my mind of it is possible. I could be a yoga teacher and have a family too.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's contagious, isn't it?
Well, also just because it was an unconventional situation you had and you were making it work.
Yeah. And it was a struggle though, New York City struggle.
I know. That's one of the reasons why we probably both left after doing it for so long, but it changed a lot over the years too. So it certainly wasn't the place when I left it, it wasn't the same place as when I came into my adulthood there, you know?
Yeah, and I enjoyed those times when we were there, you know, in the Williamsburg time, and Greenpoint, and that was an alive, wonderful.
I was trying to remember where your spot was. It was way over at the end of Greenpoint, right? I remember Hair Metal opened up a location there at some point later on, but it was all the way down there. You kind of had an outpost long before anybody else was around, if I remember.
Yeah, we were the second business on the street. Pencil Factory, the bar, was the first one, and then that same owners opened up a coffee shop there, and then, you know, a whole bunch of clothing stores.
Then it was all the schnazzy breakfast places or whatever, brunch spots, if I remember.
Yeah.
So how long did you have that? It was like a storefront right there on the corner. What was it called again? I can't remember. Kusala, yes. How long did you have that spot? How long were you there?
That was 2004 to 2012, 8 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I know that at that time you were already teaching meditation, if I recall.
That's right.
And I've sort of caught wind of you since you left and went west and seen you continuing to do that work.
Right.
And part of the impetus for me to reach out to you is because I was recently started this online teacher training and have really been going back and just kind of doing a reassessment and reevaluation of what I've learned over the years and really wanting to understand what I see as very different philosophical viewpoints from in and around yoga. And for instance, I had someone on the show this week who we talked about Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and she comes very much from, I would think, from a very classical yoga viewpoint, like Shivananda tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized is that we ended up having a conversation about meditation and like what meditation means in that text or what meditation means in that tradition. And I realized it's kind of like a perfect vehicle for fleshing out different viewpoints because it's the same word. And sometimes it even looks the same, like someone's just sitting there.
Yeah.
But what someone's actually doing or what's happening or why they're doing whatever it is they're doing, it seems to me it can be varied quite a bit.
Right.
So I guess I'm curious, maybe as just some background, I know if I'm not mistaken, you teach 2 types of meditation. Is that right?
Yeah, well, 3. I was trained in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, and in Burma, and then in centers in the United States, and so it's all the meditations that Theravada Buddhist offer. So they offer mindfulness practices, which is the same as Vipassana, and Metta practice, which is a concentration practice as well. But there are other concentration objects that they use, just like in the yoga traditions. There's different concentration objects that are used in meditation. So, but primarily I teach mindfulness. Primarily I trained in mindfulness and Metta, loving kindness meditation.
Right. Okay. So let me then ask you about mindfulness, because I think it seems like, I don't know, I've heard some recent, kind of debates about it, or about how people using mindfulness to help corporations have better HR or whatever. And sometimes those, or even like using mindfulness so soldiers can deal with the trauma of having to kill people or whatever. I guess I'm kind of curious, when you say mindfulness, does that have an inherent, context to it, or purpose to it that sometimes is being removed?
I don't pick those things apart too much personally, because it can be what I call a gateway drug for people. It's an introduction, and not everybody is moved or inspired to go to a monastery like I was, and start in a very serious way. And what I saw, like I taught at Mindful in New York City, MNDFL. Did you ever?
Was that one of like the first centers that opened up just for meditation, if I recall?
Exactly. And they charged, which wasn't in the tradition that I was in. Everything was always offered on freely, really. And then, monasteries were supported on donation, and that system works. But you're being taught by monks. And so Mindful, they charged in, $30 a class. It was kind of like the Soul Cycle, thing. It was $30 for a drop in meditation. It was like, but what I would see is for a lot of people came in there and went deep. A few of the people that came ended up going to Burma, and there was, so if it's an introduction, then that's very good. And then people are either still interested, back to interest, or they're not, and if they're interested, then they can go forward with it. If we talk about the purpose of mindfulness, it's bringing attention to present moment experience. That brings benefit that are worldly benefits. It brings benefit to our relationships because we're more present. It brings benefit to work we're doing, to our stress levels, and then the deeper purpose for those that are interested is to really start to eradicate the suffering that goes on in the mind. Kaleshas in Sanskrit. I'm sure you know the word.
Mm-hmm.
But the Buddha said, I teach one thing and one thing only: stress and the end of stress. And even at his time, there were people, they wanted to focus on being generous. And so he gave teachings for people that wanted to practice generosity, or they wanted to practice, service in the world in some way, or whatever. So I don't get to. I've grown to be. I wasn't in the beginning very inclusive, and however people want to get their toe into to mindfulness is good.
It's so interesting to hear you say that. I really appreciate that. I've certainly had that same evolution, I think, of you start out with some ideas and then they tend to open up as time goes on.
Right?
I think life sort of makes you see that things aren't as fixed as you might have hoped they were. But I guess I'm curious about that you do say, like, if someone wants to go deeper, so it can lead somewhere. I think I agree. Like, it doesn't have to. Someone can just have time to sit and, like you said, developing the ability to direct attention or bring attention to the moment and to notice. Like, that has an inherent benefit just on like a, whatever they're measuring it and neurologically, or, you can put the probes on people and see for yourself or whatever.
Exactly.
But I also am curious about the traditions that these come from. And, I guess when it comes to Buddhism in general, maybe this is like a pulling back for a moment from mindfulness. I guess I've always remembered when I've had conversations with people in sort of my very informal, like, comparative religion studies. And I've often thought of and heard people talk about Buddhism in a way that it's like a non-religion religion, or like it's not religious in the same way as other religions.
That's right.
And I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are about that. It seems to me that I think it's because it doesn't have like the same like Judeo-Christian concept of God or whatever that someone would can associate with religion. But how do you think of Buddhism? Do you think of it as a religion or a practice, or how do you situate it in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what is different than other religions is that there's no beliefs. Everything that the Buddha taught, there's nothing that is required that you have to believe. Were practices, and the Buddha would say "Ei Passiko," which means come and see for yourself. And there's a really beautiful teaching to the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha said, don't go on conjecture, don't go because it's written in scripture, don't go on because all of these great reasons, specious reasoning, don't go on because the teacher is known to be a good person, but when you yourself see these things are not worthy, then let them go. And when you yourself see these things are good, then live and abide in them. And so that is everything. And that's what mindfulness is, an exploration of your own reality, your own mind. And then you see for yourself, what are the parts of our mind that are perpetuating stress? And that's something that's universal. Everybody does it. So he was really like a great psychiatrist, you could say, psychologist, philosophy, but it was a practice system. And never did he say, believe me, or I'm the son of God, or anything. And yet there's a cosmology. And apparently the cosmology of other realms and heavenly realms and hell realms are in existence, that apparently those are seeable through various kinds of deep concentration practices, which I'm sure they had been doing in the yoga traditions too. I haven't yet to achieve those concentration insights to be able to verify. But what I do know is that the people that will refer to them or talk about them are very much grounded in reason and reality and truthfulness. And that is the kind of safety that I felt when I first went into the practice. And a teacher of mine, Sayadaw U Pandita from Burma, was his profound commitment to true words and to only speaking words that can be known, refraining completely from speech if he wouldn't speculate, And so when I saw that kind of grounded reasonableness, and they start to talk about these other parts of the cosmology in Buddhism, I'm like, well, maybe it's true, but nobody's required to believe it. And Munindra, a great teacher from India, would say that he would talk about the heaven realms or whatever, and then he'd say, you don't have to believe this. It's true, but you don't have to believe it. And so therein is the difference. There's no belief. Faith, sada, is something that becomes verified from experience. Faith that not in a creator God, but faith that practice leads to benefit, leads to well-being, leads to happiness.
Wow, you kind of jumped all the way there for me with the pointing to the cosmology, because I guess that's sort of what I was kind of curious about, because I think you're right. I think that's why it's not a religion in the same sense. It doesn't have that same rules and regulations or belief systems that you have to adopt because they come from an external authority.
That's right.
It's derived through your own inner experience and arriving at it thusly. And it does seem to me that, Buddhism, it comes as far back to us as yoga does. And there's always a debate about which came first or whatever. They overlapped so much.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that they came out of, another time in human experience where it was a kind of given that there was this cosmology that we live in.
Yeah.
In a way that you describe, where you didn't need to convince people of it. It was just part of everybody's culture or whatever.
Yeah. But I do think you tune your mind and sharpen it through this concentration factor. And that's what the yogis were doing. And that's what the Buddha started to do. And I think the yogis came before the Buddha. And I don't know to the degree of realization that they had at that time. Patanjali, so I've heard a comparison where, this wisdom it's a natural thing, so that other people would have acquired it only makes sense to me, and the Buddha doesn't say, I'm the only person that could ever understand this. He says, you can understand this. What is wisdom? Wisdom meaning what causes suffering in our minds. Those Four Noble Truths, the first is that there's a universality, and you can ask any of our students we've ever had, or any of our friends, or any famous person, do you experience dukkha, translation suffering, or stress? Do you experience stress? There's no person that says no, it's universal. You're born, that is, okay, so then the Buddha said, well, there's causes to that. And there's causes that you can put in to alleviate that. And that's how simple it is. That's the simplest way to describe what Buddhism is. And so you can alleviate it in various ways by practicing generosity, by practicing not harming, ahimsa. Those all alleviate stress, right, in various ways. And then you can alleviate it entirely by changing your consciousness through meditation practice, which is what Vipassana is for. And I think the Vipassana is what, this is kind of academic speculation, and I don't too much like to go down those roads because I don't know. I didn't live at that time, and I don't have the psychic powers to see back during that time. But I think Vipassana is what was the Buddha's particular meditation that he started to, that teaching of deep human psyche exploration was a unique meditation to him that he discovered. But they were doing all kinds of cool meditations back then, and the ethical practices were being practiced, and the yamas and the niyamas,
Well, I guess I'm curious because earlier you had talked about, when we first talked about purpose, you had used the words eradicating suffering, which is a big order. But I'm curious because I think maybe it's more of the academic reading that you're pointing to, but there's always this idea of like enlightenment or realization. Mm-hmm. So what's the connection between eradicating suffering and enlightenment?
Same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. So it's not a kind of an esoteric state, but it's a realization of what causes suffering to the degree that the mind doesn't pick it up anymore. My teacher, Bante Kipapano, he's a 93-year-old Vietnamese monk. And he one time told me there aren't a lot of fully enlightened beings. There's stages of enlightenment in Buddhist practice. First stage, there are many of those. Some of the Western teachers that are around are like that. Second stage and third stage, but fourth stage is very unusual. And my teacher said of fully enlightened persons that they think only when they intend to think. So that total mastery of their mind, they're just so aware and awake that their mind never strays like your mind does to these negative afflictive places, right? Never does. And that's a possibility for all of us humans, obviously a very difficult one. There'd be a lot more of them walking around. And there's just not, but that's what full enlightenment means.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I think I have maybe met one or two people in my life who had something about them where just being in the room with them, I felt something very intense about them, some vibratory quality about them. Okay. But I don't know if I've ever met anybody who had what you're describing. And there's no way to know what's going on inside someone else. I guess I always have a bit of concern when we do that, when we talk about these like special beings who were able to accomplish this, and then all of us over here who will never get there. Doesn't that kind of create like a carrot that's dangled out that we'll never get to eat or something?
Well, in the tradition that I was in, that was never said that way. They don't really speculate. The monks are not allowed to say whatever level of enlightenment they are, and they don't speculate on it, and they don't say you'll never be there. They say you absolutely can be there, and these are the practices to do it. And so to whatever degrees, and I've been pretty darn dedicated, and it's a tough thing to overcome the negative forces of the mind, which were talked about in the yoga traditions too, our worries, our fears, our doubts and jealousy. Like, what is that? And why does it even appear except for as a tormentor for us? And so there's so many things like that in the human psyche, and that there is a possibility of seeing through it. And that's what mindfulness is, looking at it really directly. And then you stop. Those conditioned habits of the mind can be weakened. That I have seen. the weakening of the negative, so that I don't get so overwhelmed by my mind. That I've been able to experience from my dedication from practice. Total eradication, no, not yet.
I mean, I would say that I had a seated meditation practice for a long time, but I don't do a seated meditation practice. I do other kinds of meditations, but not seated as I used to. And maybe that's something we could talk about in a bit. But I think that there's certainly, as you're saying, the observation, the inward observation and inward reflection and time spent with yourself without other input, of just inwardness, that cultivation, like you're saying, of being aware of like steady and present awareness, that absolutely just has ramifications in my relationships and how I eat and everything, Yeah. So it makes sense to me that there's just a fundamental benefit to that.
Yeah. Universally. And it's nice that people are starting to pick up on that. And if people only stay with mindfulness, there will be only that much benefit, because Thanissaro Bhikkhu called it the whole course of therapy. The Buddha offered a whole course of therapy, and mindfulness was only a piece of it. And the other pieces are concentration and the ethical practices. And I'm in the process of writing right now a book, and so I've gone into the old suttas to hear exactly how the Buddha wrote about these things, or didn't write. He did not write how he said these things. And you see that he's always laying out cause and effect, and that there is the effect of regret and anxiety, remorse, that happens when we harm other people. And so if they were to start, everybody's studying mindfulness and seeing with great results how it helps people to alleviate stress. But if they were to do that with ethical practices of not killing, not causing harm with your sexual energy, not gossiping, not speaking falsely, not speaking maliciously. All of these things are part of our practices. Again, back to what you said earlier, not from a place of authority, but because when we do that, we live in regret and remorse, and it creates anxiety in us. And so it was something that I saw really early on in my practice, because Sadhu Pandita emphasized that your ethical character in the world is really important. And in the old suttas, it will say you can walk into any environment and not feel intimidated or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And it was something that I noticed right away, because I was just intent to not harm others. And the kind of confidence and serenity that started to come into my mind from doing that. And it doesn't stay forever. If I break the precepts, which I do, sometimes, if I say something, that like too hastily or whatever, we all know the mistakes we can make, but then the anxiety can come right back. So the whole system of therapy is for stress and the end of stress, including the ethical practices, including the practice of dana, which is generosity. Again, that's another thing that alleviates stress in us.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I certainly have had that experience too, that having more awareness has led to like behavioral choices or whatever, like not lying to people and being kind and prioritizing that and giving that value absolutely seems like the process of moving in this direction. If there's a direction towards realization or enlightenment, which I sometimes question whether there's I don't like to think of it as any kind of linear thing. I guess that's my issue there is when I used to think of like this sutra as like, I'm climbing the limbs of the ladder and I'm doing my asana and my pranayama, my meditation so I can get to samadhi. Yeah. Then I feel like I went wrong. Yeah. That it's not some kind of linear progression, like I have to get there like I'm not already there.
Yeah. Well, you and I were witness to so many different spiritual communities and people that got in trouble around them. And a lot of that came out of not having very clear ethical guidelines. And humans need that. We need it, I think it was something that not being harmful with your sexual energy, for example. I started practicing that. I was in my early 20s. So when any kind of temptation came up, a married man, whatever, hitting on me, and there was temptation around that, I had something to fall back on, that was like, no, this is my guide. This is my principle. And so many communities get into different trouble, and teachers, you and I both know and have seen and witnessed the teachers that have gotten into trouble because they didn't keep those principles, So it really creates safety and community to have those kinds of guidelines. And there was resistance to it, I think, because a lot of people are pushing away from Judeo-Christianity,
I know. See, I was just going to say that, because to have those principles that you're following, that's when it starts to feel more like a religion, because it's not just sitting and following your breath, it's following ethical principles. And I think they go together naturally, but I guess there's a gray line there or something, maybe.
I think so. And I think there can be the wrong reason for doing it, which would be, I would say I was in that category in the beginning. It was kind of because I should, and because I grew up Catholic. And so I had a lot of this kind of neurosis and fear in me. But Eastern cultures just don't have that kind of conditioning, so they don't worry about it as much. But you can still get there and understand the real reason for doing it is not because you should, is watch. The same thing, ei pasku, see for yourself. Does this is living the examined life, right? Does this lead to harm for you? And so breaking the precepts, being unethical, sometimes careless in your speech, that's the way we learn, And it isn't about should or shouldn't or shame, but just cause and effect. You put in that cause, you'll experience that's why the Buddha had so much compassion and how.
Yes, I was just going to say, isn't that the substrate of all of this? Isn't it? I remember when I went to India and I first got to India, I landed in Delhi and I was exhausted, and we went out and we experienced hostility towards us and we freaked out. And my friend said, let's go up north to Dharmasala. The Buddhists are there. They have to show us compassion. And we did go up to Dharmasala. We had a wonderful experience there. But compassion is kind of one of the primary principles it's all built on, right?
Yeah. But they go hand in hand in their development. So when you're developing loving kindness, which is, connected to compassion, karuna is wishing beings to be free from suffering. Metta is wishing beings to be happy. But when you develop that, you develop wisdom. And when you develop wisdom, you develop compassion. You develop compassion by seeing how and when you cause suffering for yourself and for others. And that when you do that, you're just in that moment blind. You're not seeing clearly. And that develops a compassionate heart. You know how things come to be in psyches of humans. So when you study your own psyche, which is what Vipassana meditation does, it studies emotions. It studies thoughts. It looks at them. How do they affect? Studies body. Insights that happen are like seeing the mind and body connection. Thought arises, all these rippling sensations in your body. Emotions have this kind of effect on me. They tell this kind of a story. They skew my vision in this way. They prompt me to act in this way. It's all just a study. And when you study that yourself, you know what a murderer is. You know how it comes to be. You know what whatever the terrible things that we can do as humans to each other. When you study your own mind, then you know how that comes into being. There's a great monk called Maha Ghosananda who was Cambodian, and his family was wiped out during the Khmer Rouge. And he, at the time, was in Thailand in a monastery. And a New York Times reporter asked him one time, what were you doing in the monastery during that time? And he said, I was getting to know my mind, because when I know myself, I know the world. Or when I understand myself, then I understand the world. And that's the beautiful thing. We're all made up of the same pieces and tendencies of greed, of hatred, of ignorance. So it's not so mysterious anymore. And that really will make compassion grow.
Yeah. And it just seems like there's all that observing and study you're talking about in terms of like the multi layers of psychology and like emotion and all these body experiences. It all seems to me to be like a pattern recognition, like there's patterning that happens, or there's patterning that we can observe.
Yeah.
And there's sort of an undoing of patterning.
That's right. Exactly. That's right.
And then when we feel that where do we end up? I guess that's what I'm kind of curious. Like, first of all, maybe before I go all the way there, I'm curious just on a more practical matter. When you are teaching Vipassana, what are kind of the specific things? I guess what I'm getting to is when I've talked to like yoga folk about meditation, a lot of people really want to make a distinction between the concentration aspect and what meditation is. That like meditation is more of like a state. And a lot of people say, oh, I'm meditating, but they're really just using like mantras and concentration techniques. But that people seem to think of meditation in a yoga world as not that's the dharana and the dhyana and the pratyahara, but that the ultimate state of it or the experience of it is not the doing of it. And I'm curious if there's a similar idea or a different idea about the difference between the techniques and the concentration and meditation as something other than that.
No, well, in Theravada Buddhist tradition, bhavana is meditation and it means cultivation. And so whenever you're meditating, you're habituating something in the mind. It's a mind practice, attention practice, really. Taking attention, awareness, you can use those words interchangeably, taking awareness and placing it on a specific object, and all of them have different purposes. The different meditations have different purposes. So if we put our attention on thoughts of loving kindness, which would be, may I, you, all beings be safe, healthy, and happy, then we're habituating that tendency of the mind. And because our awareness can only be on one thing at a time, the mind is then protected from the negativity of the mind, which is so regularly there, the worries and the restlessness and the fears and the anxieties and all of that. So you're not feeding that with your attention anymore, but feeding this instead. And then you're cultivating that. So the purpose of that is to cultivate that quality of loving kindness. And when you do that, you really start to see, wow, what a powerful mind state that is. What a powerful, you gain trust in it. You see that it's beneficial. You see that it makes you confident. You see that it makes you compassionate. You see that it makes your heart open up, all of those kinds of things. And then there's concentration objects. There's 40 in the Theravada tradition, where you could just focus. And I'm sure they overlap with some of the yogi, the ones from before the time, I'm sure of it. You can put your attention, for example, just on the breath. You can put your attention on a color like white or blue.
Have you come across any asanas, like any Buddhist hatha asanas or something? Because sometimes you like Tibetan yoga practices that are like, they have some like movements or stuff they do. Have you come across any of those kind of concentration forms that were like body stuff?
No, but it doesn't exist in Theravada. They're all mind work. It's all mind work, but it doesn't mean that they don't think that the body needs to be exercised. The monks just don't. That's not what they train. They train the mind. They don't train the body. And I think for us as lay people who live in the world, we take care of families. We carry a lot more stress in our bodies. We have to earn money. We have to deal with all of those things. When you're a monk, you don't have to. They carry a lot less stress in their bodies. So for us, and for me, a physical practice is still very much necessary. But I have gone on really intensive long retreats where my physical practice starts to get a lot more subtle, and I just don't need it as much. My body doesn't carry tension in that kind of protective environment.
Isn't that true? The way I found that just in general, even as I've gotten older, my need for it is different than it was at other times.
Yes, exactly. We're not so poingy as we used to be.
Yeah. And I have other ways, as you're describing, that are habituating my mind. That's very interesting because and I mean, correct me if I got it wrong, but what I heard you say is that meditation means habituating, like intentionally habituating your mind in a like positive way towards easing suffering and these other things that we talked about.
Absolutely is. And then, so when you habituate concentration, there is a prophecy that says that when concentration isn't valued culturally anymore, that ethical behavior will decrease in that culture. And we see that alive right now, right? With the distractions and the social media.
Yes, attention economy has kind of done the reverse of what we're talking about.
And so we've so much more. It's a muscle. It's not there if it's not conditioned to be there. Just like our bodies, strength and flexibility is not there if it's not conditioned to be there. And it's a muscle of the mind that can stay steady. So a muscle of the mind that stays steady, the afflictions of the mind are missing at that moment. So there's clarity. When we're clear, we make better decisions, and our work is done better. We perform our sports better, like everything does. So valuing this concentration just means keeping your mind on one thing, or it can mean keeping your mind on what you're doing. On a meditation level, that's when you can enter into these states of samadhi, which are very blissful.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.